Hey everybody, Questwise here, and I wasn't really planning on doing a video today. Wasn't planning on filming anything. I ended up with an extra day off that I wasn't sort of expecting from my normal 40-hour-a-week job, and I decided I was going to do some stuff around the house. I was going to do some household chores and a few other things, and then I decided that I was going to sort a couple of my short boxes today. I just, my local comic book store, Top Comics, and local comic book convention, Cherry Capital Comic Con, do this thing every so often called the Train Wreck, and it's sort of a comics auction Facebook Live event. And I may or may not have purchased quite a few issues of some comics, including some Conan comics. And so I decided it would be best if I went through some of my short boxes and of these sort of titles and clean them up a little bit, sort them out. And I wasn't, like I said, I wasn't planning on doing a video today, but I felt inspired to share with you my love of Conan and of the works of Conan and collecting Conan-inspired items and memorabilia and comics and writings. If you've watched any of my videos before, and I have several videos from way back talking about my love of Robert E. Howard's creation of Conan the Barbarian and all of that, that entails the things that he created and how it became sort of this beautiful run of comics and books and art and games. I talk about that a little bit further back in some of my older videos, but I guess I should share, for those of you who haven't seen some of those, a little bit of history about me and why it is that Conan is so nostalgic to me, and why this character in particular has become so special to me. So I was born in 1975, right? I grew up basically in the 80s and 90s, the time that D&D was at its height the first time, late 70s, mid 80s, and I fell in love with games like Dungeons and Dragons, and I fell in love with comic books. My sort of late middle school years, all the way through high school, I was a huge comic book fan. And I lived in a small town in northern Michigan where there, at the time, were no comic book stores to be found. And so buying them from grocery stores and spinner racks in drugstores is where I found most of my stuff. That's where I began to read things like X-Men and Spawn and Spider-Man. Those were the big ones that we had available in my area, or at least the ones that were on the spinner racks in the drugstores and grocery stores. So my love for all things 90s X-Men is unparalleled, but Conan was very interesting to me because I fell in love with games like Dungeons and Dragons, and I fell in love with fantasy games and fantasy literature. R.A. Salvatore's novels of Dred Stewart and The Forgotten Realms and Dragonlance by Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman. Those things, Sword of Shannara by Terry Brooks, those are my sort of basis of my childhood. And it was one day at school, I knew a guy. I wouldn't say we were really good friends or anything, but we knew each other, and we were, I guess, cool at the time with each other, especially when we found out that we both had a mutual love of fantasy literature. But I was a bit naive. I was reading things like The Forgotten Realms and the Dragonlance series and the Shannara series, and of course Lord of the Rings, Narnia, those kinds of things. But I was still sort of at that point, and this is like early 90s, I would say I was naive to what had come before. the literature of the pulp era. And one day, this friend of mine, I'll refer to him as friend because we are friends to this day. We still talk every once in a while. Still lives in the same area, but he was reading a copy of Robert Howard's, one of his Conan stories, and I don't remember which one it was. One of the books that had been printed outside of the pulp stuff. Of course, the pulp stuff took place in the 20s and 30s, 40s era. So I definitely was around for that, but they became very much more popular when they were sort of printed into sort of book format. The Ace pocket books or the Dell Yellow Spines, those types of things. And he was reading one of them, and I was fascinated by the cover. I'm sure it was a Frank Frazetta cover, some kind of beautiful artwork of that sort of time period, right? The 80s and 90s. That sort of heavy metal sort of artwork, as I refer to it. And I went looking for these stories. I was fascinated by this cover. I wanted to know more about this character. And once I started to read and was able to uncover some of the Conan stories. Now, this is well before the internet. This is well before being able to get onto Google and look stuff up and read things digitally. This was like going to the library and insisting that they need to find these sort of things for me. So it took a while, and it was very sporadic in the way that they would show up, right? And I would be able to find these stories. But I fell in love with Robert E. Howard and his storytelling processes. And when I couldn't find Conan stuff, I would read his other things. I would read things inspired like Solomon Kane, and I would read Kull the Conqueror, and whatever I could find by Robert Howard. And I fell in love with his storytelling technique. And to this day, he's still one of my favorite authors, and I fell in love with everything about him. Not that he was a great person, not that he did amazing things. I just fell in love with the fact that he was a very passionate person. Probably not the greatest person. It's well known that he was probably a bit racist, a bit sexist, in fact, probably very sexist, but a very product of his time. But I fell in love with the fact that his writing style, his technique, his imagination, and I began to dive into everything I could find. And of course, later in the 2000s, there were reprints of all of his original works, even like snippets of stories that he never finished. And of course, later after he had died, other people like Sprague de Camp and Lynn Carter had begun to pick up writing stories based on Conan the Barbarian and other characters of his. And of course, they went on to create other characters of their own, but that was one of the big things. And I'm sure that there was, because of the popularity of the character, because the character became much more popular after Howard had died, it sort of saddens me in a way to know that he probably would never get to know how popular his character had become. And I'm sure it was a cash cow for them, and they were doing it a lot for beyond just the love of the character and of Robert Howard. I'm sure that a lot of it was a way for them to make money based upon the popularity of the character. But what I want to talk about today, so that's that's where I fell in love with the character itself and Robert Howard's writings. And it was later that I discovered the comics, and I wanted to talk about the comics today because that's what I'm digging through, and I want to give you a little brief overview. I think this might become a series. I think I might at some point begin to talk about the different aspects of Conan the Barbarian in comic book form. And today I just want to give a brief overview of some of the history of the comic. Now, this is a reprint of the original Marvel run of comics, and I don't have the original. It's one of my grail objects to have is the original version of Conan the Barbarian #1. This is a reprint. I'm not sure exactly when this came out. 2019. It looks like they reprinted this as a part of the True Believers line. It was $1. I had to have it just so I could have the original story. But the original Marvel run began in October of 1970 and ran all the way until 1993. That's 275 issues of Conan the Barbarian. Now, Roy Thomas is the one that's credited with many of these stories. He was the writer. He was also, I believe, the head editor at the time of Marvel Comics. And he penned most of these himself. In fact, he wrote issues 1 through 115 of the 275 issues of the Conan comic itself. In 2017, I'm wrong on that. Sorry, I got my dates mixed up here. I believe it's 2004 through 2017. Dark Horse Comics took over the line of Conan. Marvel had lost the licensing to Conan, and Dark Horse had taken over and began to print their own line of Conan the Barbarian comics. The rights returned to Marvel in 2018. They began to incorporate Conan into things like Savage Sword issues such as this, and we'll talk more about Savage Sword of Conan in a minute. They also began to incorporate him into the Savage Avengers. He became a character as part of that in the Savage Lands idea that Conan was living in the Savage Lands and would fight side by side with characters such as Wolverine and Beast and some of those other characters as well. What's interesting to me, beyond sort of these original comic lines, right, that Marvel had been doing, you have to understand a little bit of the history behind the Comics Code Authority. Right, in 1954, up until about the 2000s, the Comics Code Authority had insisted that all comics be printed. It wasn't a law. Comic books didn't have to follow their authority, but a lot of retailers would not carry them unless they had the stamp of approval by the Comics Code Authority on the cover. And I don't know that I actually have one with that particular logo on it. But if you haven't seen, I mean, I'm sure if you're a comic book fan, you're fully aware of what the Comics Code Authority is. They basically said that, comic books were at that point sort of a thing for juveniles and for children. And therefore, they should not have things like overabundance of violence and gore and crime and sex. And so a lot of retailers would not carry them if they didn't have that stamp of approval on the actual cover. And so within that, what Marvel had done, and I thought this was kind of a genius thing when I learned about this, they began to create things like this, the Savage Sword of Conan the Barbarian. This is a magazine edition, right? This is considered a Marvel magazine, right? As it can be seen here. And what was interesting about it was that magazines did not fall under the Comics Code Authority, so these could be sold with much more adult themes, such as nudity and excessive violence. But they were also incorporated things like, as you can see here, they would have full stories told out in comic book form, but they would also have articles in them, such as the Savage Sword books of Conan, talking an article about the sort of collectability and aspects of literature, written word type stories of Conan himself. So they had a sort of very magazine appearance to them, and that appealed to a much more adult type of audience over and above sort of the Comics Code Authority type of restrictions. Now, a lot of the Conan comics didn't fall under that. A lot of them were published without that stamp of approval on them, because the stories of Conan were very much adult-oriented type of stories. A lot of the comics that fell under that, at least under the Marvel line, were things like X-Men and Avengers and Iron Man and Captain America, where they would keep things a little bit more tame for a younger audience. The Savage Sword of Conan magazine format ran from about 1974 to 1995, including a total of 235 issues, in addition to what was currently going on with the sort of comic book run as well. So to me, it's a very nostalgic type of thing. You know, I look at this one here and it says right on the spine 1979. I would have been 4 years old at the time that this comic came out and hit the shelves. And it was very much a sort of adult-oriented type of thing. Think of things like Heavy Metal magazine, right, where they'd have comic book stories, but were very adult-oriented. Lots of nudity, lots of gore, lots of excessive violence. And I remember my uncle having a few copies of Heavy Metal magazine, and I would flip through them and just be enthralled, knowing that like, these were things that as a child I probably should not be looking at. And Heavy Metal magazine runs to this day. Interesting kind of run for storylines of comics that were very adult-oriented. But it's interesting to see that sort of history of Conan and the comics, and how it sort of avoided the Comics Code Authority and the run of between Marvel and Dark Horse, and how Marvel took back over. And I believe at this time, and I'm not 100% sure, Marvel has lost the license to Conan the Barbarian. And again, I was in the book industry for a very long time, and it's interesting to see how the sort of copyright of characters comes and goes. There are several Conan stories that are public domain, so Conan can be used by a variety of different sources, sort of like Sherlock Holmes, in that there are a lot of those early stories that can be used in public domain. But there's still a Robert Howard estate that holds the Conan sort of copyright to the character, and there are certain stories and certain themes of Conan that cannot be used as public domain by anybody. I just want to give you a brief overview of the Conan sort of publishing history as it comes to comics, my love of the character, and I think I'm going to actually create this into a series over time as I feel inspired to present them, of different aspects of the Conan comics, different periods of the run, different looks at sort of the Dark Horse comics versions as opposed to the Marvel comics versions, and how the writing sort of compared between the two, talking about things like Savage Sword of Conan, the magazine editions, and my collection of that stuff as well. I hope you've enjoyed this video. It's kind of a rambling, sort of top of my head look at my love of the Conan character, the writing styles of Robert E. Howard, and what the popularity of the character has become over time. So until next time, I'm Questwise, and as always, my friends, please stay safe and game on.